in the ITR, which would have seemed unthinkable in the beginning of the 2000s. Importantly, they all seem to rally around one principle and one idea, which is tax fairness. The EU had a leading role in this development. It also, however, embraced the language of tax fairness and introduced within the EU framework reforms of comparable ambition under the tax fairness banner. So if you look at the tax initiatives that the EU introduced before the 2010, they were all presented as promoting economic efficiency, free movement of goods and services, and generally fair competition. But beginning with tentative references in 2012, fair taxation seems to be placed front and center in all EU initiatives, especially after 2014 with the BEPS project, So, for example, Commissioner Pierre Moscovici placed fair taxation front and center when presenting the tax transparency package of 2015. A year later, stated enforcement actions by the Commission against the tax rulings that certain member states granted to powerful MNEs, the Apple Ireland case, were all presented as promoting tax fairness, were accompanied by press releases emphatically referring to tax fairness. Most strikingly, however, and the part which is mostly interesting for me from my thesis, is that tax fairness has been explicitly introduced in the preambles of directives which are binding for member states. So indeed, you can find references to tax fairness or fair taxation in the preambles of the Anti-Tax Avoidance Directive, the reforms of the Directive on Administrative Cooperation, and the directive introducing Pillar 2 in the EU legal framework. Now, this is important because, as we know from EU law, preambles are what crystallize the meaning of directives, and they can be used as a lens through which you interpret the whole directive. So they're up for interpretation by the Court of Justice of the European Union and by national courts as well. And indeed, there is a case of 2024, a pretty recent one, Belgian Association of Tax Lawyers and others, where the Court of Justice of the European Union explicitly refers to tax fairness. This is all good and nice. The issue, however, here is that as tax fairness has become a legal term of art, we have no idea what tax fairness means more generally and specifically as a matter of law. And this is exactly what my general PhD thesis aims to do. So it aims to examine what is the meaning that tax fairness as a concept takes within the EU legal framework, and whether it acquires legal substance or is used mostly as a rhetorical device by the European Union. So how does the PhD thesis fit into the literature? The project contributes first and foremost to the literature on tax fairness, which is now getting renewed and serious interest, but from a supranational perspective. Unlike previous efforts on the EU tax fairness issue, it will not merely be a discursive analysis of the Commission's agenda, but it aims to look at primary legal sources and examine whether the term takes shape and how it takes shape as a matter of law. In addition, when attempting to evaluate the use of this tax fairness concept, I will not be using a traditional state-centric interpretation of tax fairness, which is what has been done up until now. So not just tax fairness as tax equity and ability to pay. I will be looking at the evolving literature in the international tax fairness debate to see how this has been interpreted in the international level. So tax fairness between states rather than inside states themselves, deeming it more appropriate. So, speaking about the international tax fairness debate, let me get into the specific piece. The reason as I mentioned, why I started my PhD project from the international tax fairness debate is because the term has been introduced within the EU framework and started being used by the EU just 10 days after the G20 Los Cabos meeting, and most of the directives have to do with OECD initiatives. And in addition, it's interesting because even if tax fairness and tax equity trace all the way back to William Petty and Adam Smith, these mostly focus on interpersonal tax equity, that's between taxpayers, while I'm mostly interested in looking at what tax fairness might mean in the international debate, so looking at the IDR. Interestingly, this term does not show up just one day randomly during the BEPS conversations, but I traced the term back and found that tax equity concerns can be traced all the way back into the ITR's first conceptualization with the 1923 Four Economists report. So this report has been considered as being the beginning of the ITR, so the foundational basis of the ITR. And what it aimed to do is assess the economic consequences of double taxation. The allocation of taxing rights that the report proposed, which is the well-known active income at source, passive income residence, have been considered to be standing for more than a century after its introduction. What is interesting here is that instead of placing political considerations or economic considerations of efficiency as front and center in making this proposal of allocation of taxing rights, I saw that the report placed tax equity as the central axis of these further negotiations, operationalized through the ability to pay. So more specifically, it noted that the individual's whole faculty should be taxed, meaning that whatever solution we come up with in allocating taxing rights, it should be a situation of double non-taxation should be avoided. In addition, it recognized a legitimate interest of certain countries, capital important ones, for being allocated taxing rights. The basis for allocating those taxing rights and justifying them, the allocation of taxing rights to those countries, however, was not proposed on the basis of political and economic considerations, but instead as a continuation of the concept of political allegiance, which is an inherently moral justification. Now, it would not be unfounded if someone said that this report has been adopted by countries because it served the interests of powerful nations like the US. However, what I'm mostly interested in, and this is why I'm focusing on the initial, or when it came up in the Four Economists report, is that for more than a century after the introduction of those principles, we have, when making discussions about how this political compromise came about, the moral justifications and moral concerns, the underlying moral concerns of the drafters of the debate have been completely omitted from discussions. And so the ITR's development in the years that followed lacked completely a moral compass. The discussions were solely focused on economic efficiency and the efficiency of the national tax systems. And as such, some countries have been unilaterally raising taxes after the World War I, while those countries that did not follow suit due to necessity, strategy, or just their mere conservatives to follow suit in raising their taxes as well, have been turned into tax havens. Any efforts made by the G7 and the OECD to tackle the negative externalities that the tax havens were exerted have been severely criticized by the scholarship because they were stressing the importance of tax havens for the efficiency of the general tax systems, as also Paul mentioned in our first seminar today. And this has led to internalizing the normality of tax havens. That is not to say, of course, that countries did not find ways to counteract the negative externalities that the tax havens were exerting. Of course, some countries, like the US, have profited, or even some scholars argue have assisted their multinational enterprises in lowering their tax rates abroad, while many countries have used tax havens to engage in what Andrea Binder calls politics of the invisible. So you use those tax havens to attract FDI in your jurisdiction without formally lowering your tax rates, and thus under the nose of your median taxpayer. And this has been seemingly working well until a series of shocks, beginning with the 2008 global financial crisis, exposed the systemic issues in the ITR, and I think crucially, and for the first time, alerting voters about what has been going on throughout these years in the ITR. And it was at this point that engaging with tax fairness seems to have become a political necessity. From this point, tax fairness has suddenly resurfaced, and it has been presented by the OECD itself as the motivator for the two most revolutionary changes in the ITR, speaking for BEPS 1 and BEPS 2, aiming to change a century-old way of allocating taxing rights. the critique of the fairness of these reforms, I think, might be well known to some of you. Even the more revolutionary ones, like the automatic exchange of information, because they're based on the principle of reciprocity, so you need to have a system running to receive information from other states, have been criticized for placing huge administrative burdens at countries that are already at administrative capacity. So they require a huge amount of resources and expertise to not only put in place, but also keep those systems working, make sure that the data is not leaked, and so on and so forth. And as such, capital important countries and developing nations more generally have started to lose faith in the OECD and have been calling for transposing global tax governance from the OECD to the UN. Now, the purpose of this section, what I wanted to showcase through the first section, is that first, there seems to be a foundational basis for talking about tax fairness in the international level, so in conversations and negotiations between states. Even if the results of the report have been adopted for self-interested reasons, I argue that this does not delegitimize fairness as constituting a principle that is underpinning and underlying international taxation. And second, if we want to avoid the term of tax fairness being captured by self-interested reasons, powerful nations, or also if we just want to avoid, again, coming up with solutions that are very soon after deemed as suboptimal, engaging seriously with tax fairness seems to be, at this point, indispensable. And on this latter basis, the second section of my piece is trying to map exactly this engagement. The scholarship has recognized the necessity for trying to define tax fairness. So I'm in this second part, I'm trying to map the literature and these approaches in doing so. So to map the literature, the pieces I used are those that are only explicitly referring to tax fairness and tax justice, and that have an internation, if not global perspective. So I'm not solely speaking about tax fairness within one state, but more generally. Mapping the approaches is, of course, a gigantic task. And the more one looks, the more they realize that drawing a clear matrix leads to arbitrary lines. And most importantly, it has the additional danger that it might obscure certain points of agreement within the scholarship. As such, I built upon a couple of efforts that have been made in mapping literature. And the piece begins by rejecting a tendency of labeling approaches as philosophical, political, or economic ones. Not only because I argue that approaches are more nuanced than that, but also because even the so-called economic approaches, do have philosophical underpinnings. For example, an approach of optimal taxation, deeming as fair tax someone that engages optimal taxation, can only be deemed optimal if we accept that if we have a utilitarian premise, which is inherently moral. In addition, the piece questions the lines drawn between internation and interpersonal equity, because it argues that necessarily our approach and our opinion about internation equity shapes what interpersonal equity means. Simply, what I mean by that is that I argue that if we don't first get to decide which country gets to tax, so tackle the internation equity part, speaking about allocating the tax burden within that tax base might be premature. So in this sense, the approach that I decided to take can be called a step-by-step mapping. So I aim to showcase more clearly the exact point in our line of argumentation where divergence happens. Very simply, what I ended up with is that the initial point of divergence in the literature seems to be the question of, is there an obligation of tax fairness altogether? So here you have one side of the literature which claims that tax fairness is merely a rhetorical term, it has no place in negotiations between states, and it should remain as such. Tax fairness is an illusion, essentially. Most approaches, however, as I found, seem to accept that there seems to be an obligation to tax fairness in the ITR. These approaches, however, diverge on another point, relating to the question of whom towards whom. Here, the approaches can be split into, first, some approaches that view tax fairness as an obligation of tax A towards its own constituents. These approaches, however, seem to ignore the reality of the ITR as it stands right now, because it's very easy to mess the interpretation of tax fairness that one state has, however it has defined it. Essentially, what they're doing is accepting the imposition of an obligation of tax fairness to one state, which, however, depends on the cooperation or generally the conduct of another state, say a tax haven. More convincing approaches seem to accept that if an obligation of tax fairness exists, it must be a sort of obligation of state A towards state B and or its constituents. The divergence here, however, is what is the basis of said obligation. On the one side, you have the approaches that think that the obligation of tax fairness of state A towards state B's people is based on those people's humanness. So every country, every state deserves having an obligation of tax fairness recognized towards its people. On the other hand, you have scholars agreeing that tax fairness is merely a relational treaty, and you always a level of relationship is needed. However, these approaches do not define clearly what that level of relationship must be, because as the ITR stands right now, most countries have double tax conventions and bilateral investment treaties with one another. So they've not made clear what exactly that relationship must be. Now, finally, and interrelatedly and irrespective of the basis of the obligation, all approaches seem to vary in the extent of the tax fairness obligation. On the one side of the spectrum, you have these approaches that think that tax fairness means respecting one state's sovereignty and not provide opportunities for its override. So not trying to provide opportunities for its override. While other scholars argue for more revolutionary approaches, even a whole restructuring of the ITR altogether. These, however, approaches are much more limited than that. So, as you can see, the conversations at this point seem to be at a somewhat primitive point. This, I don't know if it comes as a surprise. Nigel and Murphy have noted all the way back in 2004 in the Myth of Ownership that philosophical conversations on tax fairness within one state seem to be at a somewhat primitive level. So if we transpose it on the international level, where we're lacking maybe even international organizations that enjoy legitimacy, it makes sense. And it raises the question of whether coming to an even tacit agreement seems possible. There seems to be, however, an agreement in the scholarship about the importance of procedural fairness as a first easy to agree on step. Of course, procedural fairness cannot be completely separated from substantive fairness. What this means is that in order to say that we have fair negotiations between states, certain substantive background conditions must exist, meaning that states must have sufficient resources, must have other alternatives, and so on and so forth. And it is at this point, to alleviate these concerns, that Ana Paula Jurado has suggested that negotiations happen within international organizations, as they do today, but not between states, but between regional organizations, and better crystallize all views. Or as I like to see it, after these views have been first crystallized within regional organizations. This approach of regional interpretations has the added value that first, regional organizations can better secure leverage within international organizations. But also, if you have first negotiations on a closer level with fewer participants, it better crystallizes the position of all players, and all views are likely to be heard. So so these regional interpretations have this added value. Now, at this point, I'm not taking a particular stance or saying this approach seems to be better than another. I'm just merely stating where exactly we're lying in the international tax fairness debate. I'm just merely mapping the approaches. And the outermost point seems to be the importance of procedural fairness and a solution of regional interpretations that cooperate and negotiate with one another. Not just one whole interpretation of what tax fairness means, universal. And it is at this point that the general project takes an added importance. So on the one hand, an interpretation is not only needed because now tax fairness constitutes a term of art, so it's important to have a clear legal meaning, but also the current state in the ITER tax fairness debate seems to be pushing for regional interpretations, multiple regional standards that negotiate with one another. And as such, the project would offer the first approach towards this trajectory, offer a transnational perspective of what EU tax fairness might be. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Eduardo, you're okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ioanna Clary. And now I am delighted to invite Professor Marco Greghi from the University of Ferrara in Italy to offer his feedback. Over to you, Marco. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for this invitation, for the opportunity for having this event together with the friends in Valencia, of course, the whole team of the whole Spanish team. How to begin with? Well, I read the paper 2 or more times, actually. It was really exciting. It was so thought-provocative and much more than that. Talking about fairness in taxation, Eduardo, is just like talking about justice and mapping fairness or mapping justice as well. Perhaps a bridge too far, or maybe 2, or even 3 in that respect. Okay. So you can. I had some noise in the background, but I hope you can hear me. Just like Miranda, I have prepared a couple of slides, and I will share the slide like in 10 seconds. But you know, why talking about fairness is, in my view, dangerous, because it's very difficult to separate the scientist, the academic, the professor, in some respect, from the man, from the person. Each one of us, everyone has his or her own understanding of fairness, of justice. So analyze a paper like this, which is outstanding. It's really awesome. Well, analyzing a paper, keeping separated the personal view about fairness and justice is quite challenging. While I was reading it, all the positive aspects of fairness, etc. Well, I don't know why, Eduardo, but that reminded me that tiny small part in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, where Shylock negotiates an agreement with Antonio, I think, for the famous pound of flesh. But that pound of flesh, in consideration for a loan, was defined fair, a fair amount. Was that fair indeed? Was that fair, that payment? It was not, of course, at least in my view. That was fair for Shylock. So what is my point? We have to be not careful, but super careful when we deal with these general clauses, because the outcome that we may find could be, well, not the one we would expect. That's why I appreciated the paper, absolutely, but I appreciated even more the first slide that Ioanna shared, because I think that she changed the title in the paper. The project is Tax Fairness in the European Union, a stealth tool of tax harmonization. But in the PowerPoint, it was something like an instrument. And why is that? Because when me as a European, read a stealth tool for tax harmonization, oh my God, my goodness, was that instrument in the hands of the Court of Justice could lead to unexpected result. We have a few minutes, Eduardo. Let me tell you a very quick story, no more than 60 seconds. We all experienced COVID in our countries, of course, and Italy, when we were during COVID, was in a serious situation of distress. Actually, we are still there. And in order to address the financial situation that, qualify my countries and has been qualifying Italy for decades, the government decided to freeze all the salaries of the civil servants. So instead of having our salaries adjusted or increased according to inflation, etc., that was frozen because of the extraordinary situation. Judges in Italy, Eduardo, are civil servants. So even their salary was frozen, like mine, like the salary of all the others. Well, a couple of judges challenged that provision in front of our constitutional court, claiming that it was unfair to freeze the salary of the judges. And the constitutional court ruled in favor of the judiciary, saying that it was not consistent with the fairness principle to have the salary of the judges capped. So all the others had the salaries capped, police force, professors, and all the others, but the judge. Why is that? Because of fairness. So be careful when we talk about that. A different understanding. Now, talking seriously, and let's go to the slide in order to delve into the paper and all the aspects that Mrs. Clady has addressed. The most challenging person to start the PowerPoint. I hope you can see it, hopefully. Unbelievable, immediately. Normally I experience problem. So these are the points that I found of extreme interest in the paper, and these are the aspects that I would like maybe to discuss about and to hear a feedback from Miss Clady. The nature of the principle of fairness. The second, the actual impact of it on the different legal systems in Europe and beyond. Third element, the international dimension, because Ms. Clady actually pointed out that there are different perspectives through which we can look at the principle of fairness, the national dimension, the international dimension, and at the very end, the regional perspective, which is indeed the value added in the paper, and I believe also in the forthcoming thesis, as Ms. Clady pointed out. So a very simple and down to the ground observation. The nature of the principle of fairness, of a tax fairness, call it as you like. It goes with many names, indeed, as Ioanna pointed out. Reasonableness, proportionality, justice, of course. She mentioned tax justice several times in the paper, and that is absolutely correct. So for me, as an academic, as a person that looks at the theory rather than the practice, the first element, the first question that I raised is whether we consider fairness, reasonableness as an a priori principle, something that comes before the law and inspires the law in the different legal system, and also at international level. There is evidence of this in history. Of course, most of the authors centuries ago do not always talk about fairness in law or fairness in taxation. They call it with different names. Cicero in the ancient Rome talk about the recta ratio. I mean, it's the right way to see the things, the appropriate way to see the things. But even in John Locke, if we do, like, I don't know how to call it, fast forward, the principle of fairness, of logic, of reasonableness comes up several times. So there is, in French, I would call it a fil rouge, a tiny red line that connect all these values, connect all these principles, and bring us eventually to the idea of fairness as we conceive it these days in the area of taxation. So maybe an exercise for Ioanna in the next month would be to track down how the idea of fairness has developed through centuries, because there are so many connections and so many points in common dating back to the ancient philosopher, thinkers, and of course, lawyers. This brings us, however, to an idea of fairness that is deeply rooted in what we call the natural law, or a jus naturae, kind of law that predates, comes before the national legal system, whatever they are. But of course, there is also the positive law, and Ioanna points out the idea of positive law in many aspects of our paper. But in this case, if we want to accept, if we want to embrace fairness in taxation, in tax system of the country, we have to find an acknowledgement of fairness within the system. In my country, for instance, the principle of fairness is somehow codified. The public administration has to behave fairly towards the taxpayers. And so that general principle is also copy and pasted within the positive law. And as a consequence, the judiciary in my country, but I don't want to talk about my country, is entitled to rule using fairness, not only as an overarching idea of behaving for good, but also as a rule of the system. But this is still a tremendously Eurocentric approach to the idea of fairness, and the responsibility is mine bad. Beyond Europe, there are other, I don't know how to call them, fingerprints of the principle of fairness. However, they are called in different ways. So, Ioanna, I think that one of the challenges you will have to deal with is that the topic of your research, tax fairness, or the principle of fairness in law, well, is a bit deceiving because it changes. He loved the masquerade and the masks. The name changes, but the value of the principle stays the same. Beyond the European Union, and I have to confess, I'm not an expert in this respect. Well, if we look at the Muslim world, they have their own tax connected to their religious belief, the zakat. And why is that? Because if you read the holy reading, the Quran is fair, is appropriate to pay that tax, is the right thing to do, etc., etc., etc. And in the South African tradition, and I owe there's reference to some colleagues of mine that teach in South Africa. They have another different principle, the principle of Ubuntu, that means actually not fairness, but solidarity, coming together, behave properly. And there is evidence that it has been applied also in the field of taxation. So again, Ioanna, if you are searching for regional evidence, if you have decided to pursue the regional approach to the concept of tax fairness, well, I believe that, well, of course, your researches will be mostly, but not exclusively, Eurocentric. But there are other areas around the world that really can offer you a wealth of information, different perspective, and also different flavors of the principle of fairness. I just cited the zakat, the Ubuntu, but also I didn't want to make the things too much personal. Even in my church, in the Catholic Church, they have their idea of fairness in taxation. This is the social doctrine of the Catholic Church that was codified some decades ago, actually, that provides for an idea of fairness in taxation, which is very similar to the ability to pay and the need to redistribute wealth, that should be enforced by the member of the parliament, by the policymakers, by the academics that are part of the Catholic Church. But I'm just discussing, and I don't want to provide further details on discussion. So at least three perspectives, but there are many more, three different flavors of that idea of fairness that you are currently investigating. And the impact, another part of your paper is, of course, dedicated to the impact of the principle of fairness, because actually we are academics, all of us, but we have to look at the practice and the real life outside our offices and outside our departments. Well, the substantial impact, indeed. And even in this respect, fairness changes the name, but the idea of ability to pay, the idea of non-discrimination, all are part, all are, I would say, manifestations, appearances of that principle of fairness that you are investigating. And if that is the case, if that is the one possible understanding of the principle of fairness, but I believe that all in all, we are going back to another philosopher of the ancient age, like Aristotle, in the ethics Nicomachean. Sorry for my terrible English and spelling. Nicomachean ethics, where the principle of non-discrimination and fairness is codified probably for the first time in the Western world. It all starts from there, at least in my view, or most of it. Formal impact in one of your in the paper, but also in your presentation a few minutes ago, you mentioned the formal impact or the procedural aspect of fairness in the field of taxation. Well, yes, indeed. But in this respect, I believe that the most challenging part for you is to see what is the difference and where is the difference between the general idea of fairness in the due process clause, the adversarial procedure, equality of arms. So, Ioanna, maybe later when we shall hear your feedback, what is the difference? Or so to say, what is the value added that fairness might provide in this respect? And that goes beyond the idea of due process, adversarial procedures, equality of arms, etc., etc., etc. If I were in the shoes of the devil's advocate, if I were in the shoes of a possible, like I don't know, discussant in another moment, I would say to you, well, do we really need the idea of fairness and in the procedural, aspects concern taxation? Are we really in need of this principle? Isn't due process clause enough to this purpose or not? Maybe later we can elaborate also this point. Another couple of minutes, then I will promise will be over. And then eventually, of course, the international dimension here. I don't know how to begin with. This is very personal. I told you from the very beginning that the most challenging part of this discussion is to keep separated the academic from the personal, to keep separated the academic perspective from the very personal view that are, whatever. The international, you call it, Ioanna, you call it international tax regime in the paper and in your writing. Have we really got a regime at international level? How would you define a regime in that respect? To have a regime, you must have, from a political point of view, an authority, a person in charge with the power to decide and to take a decision. And the authority is built according to some very dangerous philosopher. I know that. I know the story. So it's very dangerous to quote Carl Schmitt, but needs a decision and not a rule. So when you use words like international tax regime, be careful, because we are on a slippery slope in this respect. There are other prominent academics, not tax lawyers, not even lawyers, but political scientists like Hans Morgenthau, so far away from Carl Schmitt, on the opposite side of the world, so to say, that provided evidence in his view that the abstract moral principle, ethics, fairness, etc., cannot be applied to international politics. And there exists a difference that you cannot overtake between the moral aspiration of a nation and the universal moral principle. That doctrine is called realism and is somehow deeply rooted, as we know well, in many American scholars. Of course, you cite the work of the League of Nations, 1923, and quite in the most appropriate way, you cite the position by Seligman, Einaudi, and all the others. But you know how the League of Nations ended up. You know what were the flaws of that organization. An international tax regime, of course, the OECD, the BEPS, the Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Pillar 3, call it as you like. It's super fascinating for us as a tax lawyer. But what kind of regime is that? And the inclusive framework of can we really allow a majority of state to decide for all the others and impose those standards? Is that fair in your point of view? Is that the way in which you conceive fairness in the international community? Last but not least, of course, the last slide by me, the regional perspective, which is actually the core. And as I said, probably the value added of the book or the thesis that you are writing or you shall write in the future. So it seems to me the question I would ask you, you are pursuing this regional approach because you think that there are different flavors of fairness according to the territory, or do you think that it is also a matter of ideology? So the idea of fairness that we have in Europe is different from the idea of fairness that you can find I don't know, in China, in the Middle East, in regions far away in the world. I was personally shocked years ago when I was a visiting professor in a country in the East far away from mine, and I was invited to a presentation to talk about the rule of law. And there was a colleague of mine from a university that I once cite in a country that I won't mention, that say, well, talking about the rule of law, say, well, Marco, the rule of law is like a piano. Once you have your piano, you can play the music you want. And I was personally shocked when I gave this definition, which made me smile on that occasion, but in the long run, it scared me just a bit. So coming back to your paper, to your thesis, and to your presentation, what are you in search of when you delve into the regional experiences? What is the outcome that you expect to find over there, besides the technicalities that are, of course, of extreme importance in this respect? In my view, my very personal view, it's very difficult to think about, to enforce fairness without a system. And probably this is the reason why you have put European Union perhaps at the center of your research, because in the case of European Union, indeed, yes, indeed, we have a system over there. And so we can elaborate through the judiciary, through the policymakers and the academia, a concept of fairness that is actually working. But if we widen our horizon and we try to embrace the entire world, because I believe that in the long run, that is your goal, well, I don't know what the outcome shall be, but I'm eager to read it from your thesis. So congratulations for that. Congratulations for the paper, and all the best for your future. And I stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Greggy, for the very, very insightful comments. It's a lot. And if you could share the slide as well, it would be very, very helpful. Now, to answer and to address some of the concerns and get your feedback on them as well, I'll start maybe from the end of the meaning of regional. First and foremost, I want to make clear, maybe I didn't present correctly, that actually it will be a Eurocentric project overall, my PhD thesis. And this is because at this point, it's not a question of whether we need to interpret tax fairness, but it's a de facto, it's an answered question, because right now, tax fairness constitutes a lege artis. It's a term of art that it's in preambles of directives. So it's within the EU legal system, in directives that are binding for member states. So at this point, when you have the Court of Justice referring to and interpreting directives by referring to tax fairness, this very general principle that I 100% agree, if we ask every single person in this room what they think tax fairness is, we will get a very different answer. I completely agree. But this is the situation, the legal situation where we are right now, as a matter of law, that we have within the legal framework of the European Union a term like, we have generally the term of fairness within other directives, but here tax fairness specifically as that's been presented maybe by the Court of Justice in the case of Belgian associations are maybe the principle of EU law, or starting as a principle of EU law, then we really need to examine what that core is, what the EU core of tax fairness is, so that then it can be interpreted within specific countries. As you mentioned Italy, I think, where they mentioned fairness, but I'm not only interested in fairness more generally, treating the taxpayers fairly, but specifically this term of art as tax fairness and what that means. We need first to find what that core, that European Union legal core is and what it means, so that then the countries can interpret it and use it within, I don't know if it's court decisions or if it's laws specifically. So what I'm mostly interested is tax fairness as a matter of law. So looking at the legal context specifically, and this is why I'm mentioning procedural fairness and principles as such. So I'm not looking, and I'm also not scared, but I'm not very interested in the philosophical and ethical context of this debate, especially and exactly because, as you very correctly pointed out, it is when you have questions that have moral underpinnings, it's a black box. And I do not want to come here and say that I believe that EU tax fairness as a principle normatively should be this. This is not what I'm doing. I'm not confident nor competent to do this. I'm not elected to do this. So my PhD thesis is focusing on what tax fairness is as a legal principle, as a legal term of art. So I'm not looking at Aristoteli's and Mexicanico Magia. I'm very interested in that. I happen to be Greek as well. So this is something that I also have near and dear. But it's a very heated discussion. And this is why, as I'm viewing it as being used in the international context, I am focusing on, I'm not saying that this is the correct approach, but I see scholars pushing for maybe procedural fairness as a first step that is easier to agree. Again, as I mentioned, and as you correctly pointed out, we cannot really separate procedural fairness from substantive fairness. Is it fair for a majority of countries to decide X, Y, Z for other countries? No, I don't think it is. But maybe it's the first easy to agree on step, but it is better than agreeing on nothing at this point. And regional interpretations might be a good way forward because it at least secures that Ghana and the US might have not an equal footing, of course, but if we're talking about the African Union or the European Union, maybe a better footing than they had before, if we have regional interpretations. Now for the EU, as I've said, I'm focusing on the EU because this is a legal term at this point, and it's also easier. It's I don't know, a primal, not only regional approach, territorial organization, regional organization, not above than anything, but it's a nice case study and can be the first step maybe into other regional organizations doing the same, whether that is the African Union using the Ubuntu principle, the togetherness. That would be very interesting to see. But for my PhD thesis, I'm only focusing on EU law. So EU state aid law, how has the Commission used this tax fairness? Is it principle? What is it to see this, how they have prosecuted these tax rulings by the European states, what that means for competition law, for state aid law, for EU tax law specifically. So focusing on law. About the title change, you were very sharp to note it. So I had this discussion with Professor Dominic de Koven when I was presenting in the University of Cambridge, and he approached me and he said this harmonization is maybe very University of Florence influenced, maybe focus on other issues like the rule of law. What I'm trying to do essentially is trying to interpret tax fairness as a matter of law through other than fairness terms. So we'll be looking again at the ability to pay, which is something that I'm saying that all EU countries have introduced within their legal system one way or another. Rita de la Feria has also made a very, very interesting research on that point. The arm's length principle, how is it being introduced within legal systems of EU countries? So competition law, state aid law, specifically thus through the legal lens and what that means. Now I changed it to make it more clear what I'm doing. so that it makes sense that I'm not proposing a normative approach to EU tax fairness. I'm not saying that this is what fairness is, what tax fairness is. When it comes to the harmonization, it was there because my hypothesis is that this term has entered the legal sphere in order to pressure member states to converge on standards. So adopt the Pillar 2 within the European Union, which is now a European Union directive. So it's not just a suggestion from the OECD. Convergence standards, and also pressure the Court of Justice of the European Union to grant the Commission more deference in issues of taxation, saying that I have my tax DG now in the competition department. I am more than competent to deal with questions of taxation. At least I'm more competent than the Court of Justice to deal with questions of taxation. And this could be maybe an example of that could be the Apple Ireland case, which is something that I'm really focusing on. And the Commission was presenting and was bringing this tax fairness narrative in press releases and in binding legal documents as well. About the final point where you mentioned the regime, I have to think about that again. What I mean by regime is mostly focusing on international tax governance. And if we're talking about international organization of the OECD, I also like, there's a paper by Ruth Mason that begins with one of the jokes that US tax law professors used to begin their classes with, is that there is no international tax law, but more and more this is not only not funny, but not true, because how the international tax system is right now, there's such a strong influence from what one country does to the choices that other countries do in their own tax system. So I'm not really sure if we can say that there is no international tax law, or at least there isn't that much of an interaction between one state and another. And this is why I made that choice, but I need to, I will revisit it and maybe make it more clear why I am referring to an international tax regime should be an international tax regime in mind. But more generally, I don't know if I missed any points, but it was very, very interesting. I need to clarify some things, make it clear that I'm referring to the EU legal concept of tax fairness. And I wanted to see, because tax fairness entered the EU legal system influenced by the OECD, I'm trying to make sense of what tax scholars say about the meaning of tax fairness in international relationships. So I don't know if I want to go at the rabbit hole of what fairness is, what Aristotle thought, what Adam Smith thought, what John Locke thought. I try to stick, and this is why I mapped only approaches that explicitly refer to that term. So tax fairness, tax justice, because I'm looking at the meaning of EU tax fairness, which is a matter of law at this point. I don't know if that makes it clear. If you have disagreements with the general project, I'd be very, very happy to hear them. It's just my second year, so I'm starting my second year now.
Thank you very much, Ioanna. I would like to invite Professor Greghi to list follow-up questions, if you have any. Marco, over to you.
Well, a follow-up question. No, I think that after Ioanna clarification, it's well, all good so far on my side. I understand now that her focus is on the European Union level, and indeed, fairness is part of the directives, so it's part of European Union law. So there is a robust, a solid reference to the legal system in this respect. So Ioanna Cladi is 100% accurate on this point when he says, I'm talking about the law. We are not talking about things that are up in the sky, up in the cloud, which are important, by the way. I don't want to try to underestimate the theoretical aspect, but they are not in the agenda at the moment. So she is right. As for what concerns to me, I'm still a little scared. I'm still a little concerned, particularly when I said in your abstract a stealth tool of tax harmonization. Oh my goodness! Because yes, it is part of the law, but it's a kind of wild card available to the European Court of Justice to intervene even more in our domestic and national legal system and in the way the court seems fit. And I started my brief discussion with a joke, but that was not entirely a joke when I quoted The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. Even that payment was fair. And that was legal, Ioanna. That was a contract. That's what scares me a lot. But anyway, really looking forward to read your thesis at the very end, and good luck with your studies.
Thank you. And maybe just to answer, I completely agree. Being scared or being concerned is 100% a valid concern, because when you have this card, which is a legal card, giving it to the Court of Justice and saying, here, you can define what tax fairness means and say whether this directive or this tax ruling by one country is within the premises of tax fairness. But this is why exactly I think it's very important to have
Absolutely.
a clear definition about legally what tax fairness means, just so that we don't end up with being used as a wild card for harmonization, because this is the underlying maybe goal of the Commission, which was the one pushing for that, the introduction of the framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We still have 3 final minutes. I would like to know if there is any outstanding question.
Can I?
From the floor. Yes, Alfredo, please, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. I think it's very, very interesting and fascinating topic. I will try to be brief, and I was noting kind of 20 questions during your intervention that I will try to limit to a very few of them. First, you mentioned that there is an obligation as regards tax fairness, and I wonder to which extent can you develop that, and you derive that obligation from international law, and what is the role of international law for describing this obligation from which you can consider that tax fairness arise or may arise. Second, from time to time, I was not certain whether you were talking about fairness as regards inter-taxpayers equity or inter-nations equity. And at the end, I thought that you were trying to mix them, which is kind of interesting, that it can be even much more complicated that we expect. And I would like to know what is your opinion on that. Third one, you were referring to the international tax regime, which is a word or a phrase that I have read a few times in the last years. And I wonder whether, obviously, I have the same concerns of Marco in that regard. I haven't seen for ages this international tax regime, if any. But I do not know if you try to understand, according to what your reaction to Marco's considerations, whether you try to find kind of a coherent framework. And I wonder whether you can consider what the OECD wrote in its preamble to the BEPS action plan in order to justify what they were doing, which is to tax where the value is created and the activities takes place. And I wonder whether from that you can infer some type of principle that leads to a kind of a general previous understanding of what tax fairness should mean among nations. And finally, I think that a comment that sometimes it's missing, especially since the development of the so-called single tax principle, where it seems that at least there should be one tax because income should be taxed once, no matter how. I think I wanted to know if you consider the instrumental nature of taxes. Taxes are money for doing something. And if you do not take into account the other part of the equation, I do not know, or I wonder, how can you consider a tax fair? because a tax is fair, provided you know for what you are going to collect this tax. And because if you do not take that into consideration, probably you are missing the point. So you can assume that there are two states that apply the same tax, but one collects the tax for purpose A and the other for purpose B. And you can reach the outcome and say, oh, both taxes are fair because they reach the same level of taxation. But I doubt that this can be true, considering that we are missing why we are using that money for. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's after listening to Alfredo's latest questions, I think now we are ready to close this lot. And I would like to thank you, Ioanna Clary from the London School of Economics, for her presentation and her wonderful project. And of course, thanks Professor Marco Greghi from the University of Ferrara and Alfredo Garcia from the University of Valencia for their contributions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we start now the last break, and we have half an hour, and we come back at 6 p.m. Spanish continental time.
Eduardo, if I may, can I answer very, very briefly?
Sure.
Maybe to the points.
Absolutely. If Alfredo
Yeah, or you can answer during the break.
I'm okay. I'm okay because
Okay.
this break can be shorter.
Let's just answer maybe during the break, because they're very, very interesting points, and we would like your thoughts as well. So
Okay, perfect.
when you mention about the instrumental nature of taxes and the allocation, Sweden actually it has one of the most regressive systems in the EU tax system. So the taxing rates are imposed on a regressive rate, but because they are used, this allocative branch are used on an in a way that actually deals with inequality. Sweden also has one of the lowest levels of inequality within the European Union. So that is 100% correct point. But I was wondering whether if it makes sense to separate tax allocation and tax raising, because the tax allocation also depends on a benevolent government. So it might be safer to say that we safeguard what tax fairness means in imposing maybe taxes, and then the second section of allocation is maybe an additional point, but I don't know, I'd be really interested to hear your opinion on that. With international and inter-taxpayers, I completely agree. I'm just simply pointing that the current approaches are mapping and making matrices and separating approaches by, oh, this approach deals with international equity or inter-taxpayer equity, and I'm not really sure whether we can draw these clear distinctions, as you very, very correctly mentioned. What else? Yeah, and the rest maybe I can ask to you in the break. But thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ioanna.
See you in 25 minutes.
See you.
Bye.